My name's Brandon and this is Nickelodeon Video Game History, a show where I take a look back on all of the video games based on Nickelodeon shows and retrospectively review them. Something we never saw a whole lot of during Cartoon Network video game history was developers taking episodes or specials and turning them into an entire game. Some of the Ben 10 and Adventure Time entries did this loosely, but majority of the time they opted to do their own thing. This is in contrast to Nickelodeon, who seemed to encourage this idea. A lot of the early releases like the Ren and Stimpy games leaned heavily on episode concepts for their games, and now we're seeing games doing the whole movie tie-in game sort of thing, but for regular episodes or specials. Jet Fusion and Shadow Showdown did this, and SpongeBob games would frequently dabble in this later on with stuff like Atlantis SquarePantis and Truth or Square. And as you could guess by my structuring of this intro, Jimmy Neutron Attack of the Twonkies also does it. Based on the two-part episode of the same name, Attack of the Twonkies was released on September 13, 2004. As was the case with most Nick games at this time, it was available on PS2, GameCube, and GBA. I've always found it interesting that both Nick and Cartoon Network seemed really hesitant to embrace the original Xbox. Most of the time they flat out ignored it, or if an Xbox port was planned, it inevitably ended up cancelled. Attack of the Twonkies' home console version was given to THQ Australia, a departure from the previous two developers who have attempted to make a playable Jimmy Neutron game. As an Australian, I always get a little bit excited when I see a local developer pop up in our journey through Nick history. At one point we had a booming development scene here, and a lot of that was due to companies like THQ investing heavily. THQ founded this studio in 2003 with Attack of the Twonkies being their first ever game. It was a sign of things to come too. Their sole purpose was to churn out licensed games. After their debut, they'd go on to make the Avatar: The Last Airbender trilogy, the game based on the movie we don't speak of, SpongeBob Lights Camera Pants, and they were even working on the tie-in game for the first Avengers film. That game never materialised though, because in mid-2011 they were a casualty of THQ's increasingly falling financials. The GBA version was developed by Tantalus, who funnily enough are also an Australian studio who are still alive and well today. Don't believe me? Well, they just ported Skyward Sword to the Switch. Founded way back in 1994, they churned out all manner of licensed games, with a particular focus on handheld titles since the turn of the millennium. Most notably, they worked on South Park Rally, The Yellow Avenger, 2 Cars games, Ben 10 Galactic Racing, and they helped out with the Sonic Mania Switch port. An Australian developer being around for almost 30 years is a rare sight, so clearly they're doing something right over here. Having 2 Aussie devs working on Attack of the Twonkies might seem like a happy coincidence at first, but when you dig deeper, it was definitely deliberate. I'll go into more detail later, but these games are stunningly similar despite being on very different platforms. Having both studios based in Australia seems like it was a deliberate ploy to allow them to work together closely. Critically, the end result for Attack of the Twonkies was quite unspectacular. A 6.5 for the console version isn't amazing, but it puts it higher than every other Jimmy Neutron game so far. Although I have a feeling Jet Fusion GBA would be the highest if there were enough surviving reviews. The GBA version on the other hand slumped to a disappointing 5.6, not the greatest sign. Jimmy Neutron games, particularly on home consoles, have been a disaster so far. With one final attempt, can these 2 Aussie developers give us something kind of enjoyable? Attack of the Twonkies on GBA sets out to try and give the best first impression possible to Jimmy Neutron fans. Anybody who's even seen an advertisement for the show knows that it revolves around Jimmy's constant stream of new inventions. While retracing Jimmy's steps through the Twonkies story, Tantalus has packed in as many inventions as they possibly could. In basically every level, you'll find invention parts. Once you collect all of the parts of a blueprint, you'll create some new ingenious gadget that will make you jump higher or something. You know the drill. This version of Attack of the Twonkies is pretty interesting. It's equal parts platformer, action game, and puzzler. Tantalus placed heavy emphasis on all three areas through the gameplay and the inventions you'll create. For any game with platforming elements, you'll need tight controls, but Attack of the Twonkies has red flags immediately. One of my biggest pet peeves in 2D side-scrollers is having to double tap left or right to run. In my experience, this never works well and instead makes movement a chore. A great example of this is Samurai Jack: The Amulet of Time, a game that could have been an interesting Metroidvania, but instead it turned into a sluggish trudge that never once made you feel like a samurai. Attack of the Twonkies using this control method straight up gave me anxiety when it was first mentioned, but unbelievably it just works. This is easily the best implementation of a double tap to run control scheme that I can remember, and I think a lot of it comes down to a really simple idea. Once you start running, Jimmy will continue travelling at that pace until you come to a complete stop. Jumping will carry his momentum, so it's only when you take your finger off the D-pad that he'll slow down again. With this simple change, my opinion had done a 180. Jimmy feels like a samurai much more than Jack ever did on the GBA. Aside from running around, Jimmy can do a baseball slide attack while moving if you press B, and then you can utilise the various inventions as well. Goddard makes an appearance too, joining in on the fun of having a glut of abilities available. Pressing L and R together will bring him onto the scene, giving you great abilities like this. "What are you doing, stepdog?" The weird thing about Goddard is just how irrelevant he seems to be. While I can certainly see how his abilities could come in handy at times, I never found it actually necessary to use them. Jimmy is more than capable and equipped to deal with 99% of the chaos in the game. I even sat through a 100% long play of the game just to see if I was missing something and if expert players were utilising Goddard in some way I hadn't picked up on, but as far as I can tell, it was the same story there. The actual gameplay of every level is pretty simple. You'll platform around, solve some puzzles with gadgets if necessary, and then avoid enemies. The other aspect of the gameplay is the Twonkies. These should be a major part of the game, they are in the title after all, but they're actually pretty irrelevant. Well, irrelevant in the sense that the game wants you to collect them, but it's actually optional. The big Twonkies are still a threat to your health that you'll have to address. But yeah, you quickly get a gadget to suck up Twonkies once they get loose in Retroville, and the game wants you to collect them, but you don't need to. Collecting Twonkies is not at all compulsory and is more a 100% completion thing. This decision seems a little insane considering just how much work has gone into the capturing mechanics. It's honestly kind of like Ape Escape at its heart, or Disaster Strikes. Twonkies can only be captured in their cute and cuddly state. To capture the big bad Twonkies, Jimmy will invent various things to revert them back to their original form. This seems like it should be a core gameplay mechanic, but in reality you can skip past it all without a care in the world. The requirement to beat just about every level is to collect all of the invention parts, or beat an end of level boss battle. Twonky collecting is seemingly supposed to be a fun cherry on top. The combination of inventions and that sort of thing seems cool, but without any actual motivation to engage with this mechanic, I had no urge to suck up these knockoff gremlins. You also run into the issue of a lot of the game's inventions being dedicated to this, meaning the abundance of inventions end up being mostly irrelevant, just like Goddard. Another annoying issue I encountered was the platforming. While the movement controls are actually decent, Tantalus often constructs levels in the weirdest way, resulting in you making these awkward jumps into tight gaps, or taking really unnatural paths from platform to platform. This kind of thing is actually a pretty big issue with the game as a whole. Attack of the Twonkies on GBA is just very awkward in its design. A good example is this hamster section where you're supposed to lure it into the cage, then activate the mechanism to close the door, trapping it in the process. What should be one of the most basic sections of the game is actually one of the hardest because you have to be pixel perfect here for some reason. If the hamster dares touch the door even slightly before it's completely shut, it'll bounce back up, resulting in some truly stupid moments. It's moments like these that have you wanting to put the game down for good. It reeks of a rushed development, just trying to desperately get something out the door in time. Attack of the Twonkies can also be super unforgiving, highlighted by the fact that a death requires you to start the whole level from scratch. Kind of balancing this out is the fact that every level is like 5 minutes long at most if you're not meticulously trying to 100% it. While it seems like these two factors would work okay together, it's still insanely harsh to accidentally fall down a pit and be forced to lose all progress. To make matters worse, I honest to god experienced slowdown in one of the game's underground areas. I've literally never seen this in a GBA game before, so maybe it was an emulation quirk, but considering GBA emulation is pretty damn flawless in my experience, I'm skeptical. To round out the gameplay, we have, wait for it, yet another obligatory shmup section. Much like in the game based on the film, this pops up when Jimmy is travelling from one planet to another. It's a section that takes way too long to complete for how dull and unoriginal it is. At the end of it, you have to grapple onto the planet for some insane reason. When the game explains this, it is incredibly easy to skip past it accidentally, as the fire button is also the button to skip text. This resulted in me flailing around having no idea what to do on my first attempt. The cherry on top of this bastard mess of a Sunday is the visuals. Attack of the Twonkies on GBA is ugly. Personally, when I think back to the GBA era, I don't really associate great graphics with it, and I think it's because so many games on that handheld looked like this. At least the ones I played did. It's just an ugly glob of pixels. Obviously not every game looked like this. Heck, I've covered plenty of gorgeous GBA games created based on Nick shows, but more often than not, it seems they fall into the Attack of the Twonkies zone. Another hallmark of GBA licensed games is the lowest possible res screenshots being used as cutscenes. The majority of Nickelodeon games have tended to be their own original thing, with movie tie-ins usually being the rare exception. However, with both Shadow Showdown and Attack of the Twonkies being based on special episodes of their shows, the developers have relied on the source material for the presentation. Attack of the Twonkies is just the epitome of why I naturally assume a GBA game is going to look really bad. Attack of the Twonkies on GBA just has nothing going for it. Personally, I didn't get an ounce of enjoyment from my dull hours with it. It's clunky, basic, and unoriginal, and then to top it off, it's painful to look at. The biggest kick in the balls is that the last Jimmy Neutron handheld game was really good. I wish Helix was given another chance to make a kid-oriented Metroidvania. They were really onto something with that style. Well, let's move over to what a lot of people have claimed is the best Jimmy Neutron home console game.
Pukin' Pluto! Gotta run! Twonkus 3's entering Earth's orbit in an hour!
So, what'd I miss?
Oh, Jimmy's dating a comet and I have to go sniff animals.
Attack of the Twonkies on home consoles seems like it wants to be a 3D puzzle game. Rather than being a typical 3D platformer from this era, the idea seemed to be to leverage Jimmy's inventions for puzzle solving, similar to the handheld game. When you kick things off in the tutorial level, developer THQ Australia gives off the vibe of being overly ambitious, especially for a studio's first ever game. In the opening minutes, so many unique mechanics are being dropped on your head, to the point where it gets overwhelming and all a bit too much. You'd be forgiven for thinking this game's scope is going to be considerably larger than your average licensed Nick game. Much like the GBA game, here everything revolves around two things: scooping up Twonkies and solving puzzles through brand new inventions you create. It's one of the rare times where it genuinely feels like the handheld game was adapting the big budget home console version for the small screen. This was probably one of the major benefits of both studios being located in Australia. Naturally, the level of detail they can go into is much greater here. This is seen in the game having different classifications for its inventions. Smaller inventions of less consequence will only require a couple of resources, while more extravagant ideas will need 4 items and maybe even a blueprint. The game goes all in on inventions, to the point where it gets a bit much. You pick up new pieces at a lightning pace and you quickly feel like you're inventing something every 10 seconds. Adding to this feeling is the game coming to a complete standstill every time you grab a new invention piece. Then when you build something, you get a mini cutscene. Pacing of the gameplay is torn to shreds because of this. In conjunction with the inventions helping you deal with obstacles and roadblocks, Jimmy can utilize Goddard at certain points. Goddard basically just acts as another invention. He has a few different commands that will solve puzzles for Jimmy. And it's here we come to one of the first casualties of THQ Australia's overly ambitious game. Goddard is almost never used outside of the tutorial. Off the top of my head, I can think of like 2 times where Goddard gets used, and one of them is when he has to blow himself up. The idea is so half-baked that it would make Ben and Jerry proud. So the game throws a million different inventions and part types and Goddard at you in the tutorial, to the point where you're going to be overwhelmed. Attack of the Twonkies seems like it's going to be a clusterfuck of gameplay ideas. But then a couple of levels in, the story introduces the Twonkies and everything becomes simplified. The entire thing boils down to a single goal: vacuum up Twonkies. Levels entirely revolve around this. To actually capture them, you'll use 1 or 2 inventions constantly. If you encounter a big Twonky, you'll need to use the sound device on them for a bit until they revert to their smaller state. Once this is done, you can vacuum them up. Unlike the GBA game, this is a progression requirement. Trying to just run forward in the game without catching them always brings up a text exchange telling you to get back out there and find them. Sure, occasionally an invention is needed to gain access to some Twonkies, but this is surprisingly rare based on how much they emphasize them in the tutorial and how many inventions you create. Attack of the Twonkies boils down to doing what I just described: shrink the Twonkies, catch the Twonkies. That's the entire game. Now, this didn't have to be a bad thing. If that gameplay loop was fun, the game could have been salvaged, but the fact is, the basic act of catching Twonkies is not fun. There's nothing exciting about boringly shooting a couple of different rays at these creatures. The most excitement you get is when the camera will twist into the most awful angles ever. It's clear the game is taking inspiration from Ape Escape, but here the game functions like if all of the puzzle solving elements were stripped back from that series, and instead the monkeys were just lifelessly sitting around levels, begging for you to scoop them up. Honestly, it's astounding how much they wanted to copy Ape Escape, yet somehow missed the point. That series is about catching animals by utilizing a variety of gadgets. Attack of the Twonkies has all of those elements present, yet doesn't combine them together to actually replicate the Ape Escape formula. Playing the game, it feels like there were 2 different teams, one working on the inventions and one on the Twonky stuff. They both created their part of the game, but never even remotely communicated with each other to combine the 2. Maybe you think I'm exaggerating for comedic effect, but I'm really not. Just look at how many goddamn inventions this game has, and then try to explain why 95% of them are never required. Outside of the Twonky shrinking and catching inventions, you'll use less than a handful of inventions. There's a wrench that'll fix things occasionally, some shoes that allow you to walk on ice better, and this light refracting gimmick. That's about it for the inventions. Each boss battle does require a unique gadget to beat, but they're not needed in the regular gameplay. It's just so weird. Most of the gadgets appear to just be gags. Like, when you invent them, the description always seems like the developers put them in for literally no reason other than to amuse themselves. Like, what's the point of these shoes that draw a line behind you? I don't know if I was missing some key gameplay aspect, but to me, I was getting through every level no issues whatsoever without touching the majority of the inventions. It's kind of a blessing too, because changing gadgets requires you to go into this menu. This would have been torturous if more than a handful were ever needed. I'm just shook. They tried to make an Ape Escape clone, but then completely missed the point. They tanked the game's pacing by having you pick up invention parts constantly, only to not do anything with them. Then there's Amazon's Alexa congratulating me for being awarded a trophy every 5 seconds too.
Congratulations, 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 Jimmy. You have been awarded a...
Don't worry though, THQ Australia were kind enough to include an obligatory shmup section for our pleasure. On a more serious note, there was one section of the game I did get a kick out of. Jimmy's journey to catch the Twonkies takes him to Retroland, with the end goal of the level being to gain access to a ride where a boss battle is going to take place. Unfortunately, you can't get inside without 50 tokens, which can only be collected by playing arcade games. So for the next 45 minutes you go into an arcade and literally play arcade games, including knockoffs of Frogger and Space Invaders. This is pretty neat and unironically was the best part of the Attack of the Twonkies experience. Go figure, the best part of this mess is when you're literally playing other games. On the whole, the arcade section has a bunch of neat little touches. The Space Invaders clone is a callback to the film, and getting to see Jimmy's reflection in the arcade cabinets was a brilliant idea. But this section does overstay its welcome. To grind up 50 tokens, you need to grab the high score in each of the area's games. This ends up taking way too long. The arcade should have been a neat little breather, not something you had to grind out. The only other piece of gameplay I wanted to touch on, other than the boss battles, was this bonus level you unlock. It's a jetpack race through one of the main story's levels, which no joke takes like 10 seconds. Yet another aspect of Attack of the Twonkies that feels unpolished. THQ Australia were just trying to do way too much. Finally, I have to talk about the boss battles, at least for a moment, because god they suck. One thing they all have in common, other than the fact that they revolve around spamming a single invention, is that they're so freaking slow. You never feel in danger of dying, with the whole experience just being you slowly chipping away at their health. The final boss cycles through being vulnerable to each of the 3 inventions used on the previous bosses, which would be a pretty solid idea if it didn't have the same dull pacing as the rest of them. It also feels like a pretty underwhelming end to the game. Nothing about the cutscene leading up to this, nor the battle itself, feels like you've entered the big climax of Attack of the Twonkies. The one area where I will give Attack of the Twonkies a huge shout out is the visuals. Jimmy is a sneakily hard character to do right in video games, despite being Nick's first fully 3D Nicktoon. The first couple of games were okay, but were plagued with stiff or insane animations, and even later attempts in the Nicktoons Unite series would fumble their models. But here, Jimmy looks great in-game and in cutscenes, with the animation being very fluid. It does have its quirks though. One cutscene locked Jimmy into place while the rest of the level kept going, resulting in this Twonky just yeeting shit at him while he talked. This weird drums playing section was incredibly bizarre as well. And then when subtitles would pop up, you'd get these creepy heads to go alongside them. Having said all that, the visuals are easily the most praiseworthy aspect of Attack of the Twonkies.
Say, with that big head, I bet you have a big and just sign this recording contract.
Well, my mom said I shouldn't talk to strangers. Gotta go!
A long time ago, I reflected on what style of video I wanted to make here on YouTube. A trend I really hate is the overly negative reviewer. What started out as a quirky character with AVGN quickly morphed into a whole subgenre of people getting irrationally angry over video games. I found that dull as fuck, so set out to try and be a little bit more positive. Yes, most licensed games are going to be bad games at their core, but I find it far more interesting to try and dig out and highlight the parts of the games that worked. Despite my goal to do that, Nickelodeon has been making it extremely hard lately. They've been serving up games that are devoid of notably positive things to spotlight. Attack of the Twonkies on home consoles really only has the visuals and the arcade section that I can point to as decent. Everything else about this game whiffed it big time. I really think THQ Australia suffered massively from this being their first game, and from being too ambitious. Some of the ideas they tried to put into the game seem like they would have been a stretch for even a seasoned studio to bring together cohesively. And when you factor in this being their debut game, it's a pretty big disaster. I don't think their production pipeline was too good at this point, resulting in the Twonky catching and inventions not intertwining to the extent that they should. Overall, I do think this is better than the movie game, and maybe even better than Jet Fusion as a whole. However, the early portions of Jet Fusion are so much better than what we have here. It genuinely sucks that the one thing Jimmy couldn't invent was a decent home console game. With Attack of the Twonkies being the show's final home console game, at least from a standalone point of view, it's up to the future crossover titles to make up for this mess. Next time, I'll be talking about one of those crossover games. Nicktoons Freeze Frame Frenzy decided to cross over our favourite Nicktoons, but instead of just copying a Nintendo Party franchise, they went in a more kind of Kingdom Hearts direction. Unique gameplay and a unique story make Freeze Frame Frenzy stand out, but by being exclusive to the GBA and not carrying the Unite tag on it, it's been buried underneath the flashier games that are to come a little bit later on. Despite that, I'm still extremely excited to see what it's all about. To make sure you catch that review and reviews of the rest of Nickelodeon's games from 2004, make sure you've hit that subscribe button.